My colleague, Rachelle Akuffo, spoke to Ray Wang earlier. He's the principal analyst and founder at Constellation Research. She began by asking him about the highlights of the expo.
Great point. This was a very interesting E3. No major game consoles announced, right? So it's kind of in that lull, but remakes of games came back, right? People were excited about Final Fantasy, Wolfenstein, right? All these games that you hadn't heard in a while came back. People were really excited about that. The second thing was the fact that Nintendo won. Sony didn't show up. People were like, what happened? So it's consoles. They kind of pulled out. They didn't spend a lot on that. And Nintendo won in terms of presence, in terms of the games, in terms of the total offering. And then, of course, the cloud, right? Stadia. Google's like, hey, you can stream this. You don't ever need a console again. That became a big announcement. And then I think the other piece that people started to realize was that, this is one of the most interesting situations where media, entertainment, and technology are converging on gaming platforms.
So let's break some of this down. You mentioned Sony not showing up, and we know that Electronic Arts, known as EA, also chose not to do the press conferences. Should we be reading anything into that?
I don't know. I think part of it is people feel like maybe the show's gotten too big. Maybe it's not reaching out to as many folks like it used to. It's kind of like when Apple just stopped showing up at all these different conferences and did their own media events. Maybe that's the type of process that they're trying to think through in terms of marketing and advertising. So that may be more that than anything else. Plus, there was really no console to announce, right? People are looking for consoles, and PlayStation 5, is it here yet? No, not yet. So I think people are waiting for that.
And so with Sony not announcing its new console, does that give any rivals sort of more time in the spotlight since Sony isn't there?
It did, and I think Nintendo picked up speed there, and then I think Xbox and Microsoft actually had a lot of presence there in terms of like the new consoles that were coming out, the streaming capabilities that would be going as well, and I think they have a lot of play there, of course, along with the titles.
And you mentioned some of the trends. There's virtual reality, augmented reality. You mentioned the cloud. Tell us about how these systems are developing, how are these companies really taking advantage as this market is maturing?
What's interesting about this market is as we get to streaming and subscription services, that's going to be the next pace for growth. And what it is like once you get a character, once you get a title out there, it transcends to so many things. It could be a movie, it could be an interactive game, it could become an e-sport, it could be, you can create so many opportunities for lines and logo merchandising and IP. So it's become such a big business that the titles are almost as big as the movie studios. The movie studios are looking at the titles, right? And the technology giants are like, how do we get a piece of this? And that's where the dynamic is and the tension is going on.
And you mentioned some of these spotlighted games. Obviously, Pokemon Go is huge, and you can't go anywhere without hearing about Fortnite. How are those games doing, and how are they really evolving to make sure they're still holding on to their audience?
They're good. They're very, very interactive. But what we're seeing is also some great titles that have popped up, right? What we were saying earlier, the return of Wolfenstein is there. The Final Fantasy series is there. But we also saw the new Star Wars Jedi game, which got a lot of interest from a lot of folks. And then the other piece that was also interesting was people were looking at, what would happen in other types of interactive environments, right? With Oculus, what happens in augmented reality, virtual reality. Those were getting a lot of attention because people see the potential of how those games and interaction with 5G are going to come together.
Now let's look at some of the key players. You have Apple entering the fray now with its Apple Arcade that's supposed to be coming up. Talk about some of the well-known and some of the lesser-known companies and what they're really doing to create a buzz this year.
So Apple Arcade is actually a great example of subscription models. One thing that Apple's been pushing is the fact that because they believe in privacy, you should pay. Right? It's a very, very interesting thing. So if you're willing to pay $5, $10 a month, they're willing to support a whole bunch of game developers, people that you might have known and people that you may have known in terms of creating opportunities for them. And by doing so, you protect your privacy and you also get this very interesting experience that you wouldn't have before. So it's kind of like they're playing the benefactor role to new artists, undiscovered artists, and really creating new markets that weren't there before.
So as you look at E3, you're seeing all these different companies, not just gaming companies. We have Apple. When you have so many companies that have so much money behind them, what does that mean for the little guy, for the newcomer who's trying to get into this market?
That's a great question. I think what's evolved over time, we came from a craft industry in the 70s, the 80s, up to the 90s, and we started getting companies that massive buyouts. Conglomerates of gaming companies started showing up, and now we're actually in networks of ecosystems where we actually see platforms on consoles, platforms in the cloud, platforms and streaming services all coming together. And I think as a gamer, you have more opportunities than before to actually get distribution, but there's so many people building games that it's hard to get seen or stand out from the fray. And so I think we're going to need more I think more things like Apple, where they're actually looking for the next set of gamers and game developers, and also more venues to actually showcase the next set of stars.
So looking ahead, not just in terms of how the E3 is made up and who's coming to it, but what are some of the other trends that you think we should be keeping an eye on?
I think the big thing we should start looking is the role of more women in gaming. This E3 was interesting to me because I saw more females, more women at the event, and more younger people at E3. Used to be kind of like, the 80s crowd kind of made their way into E3, was kind of the majority of it, but I think we're seeing a whole new generation of gamers.